The morning began as most London mornings did in early spring, grey at the edges, with a drizzle fine enough to dampen spirits but not umbrellas. The fire in the Beresford's sitting room struggled bravely against the gloom, sending up a thin thread of smoke that made Tuppence wrinkle her nose. She was perched on the arm of an armchair, a heap of Morning Post balanced precariously on her lap, sorting through the envelopes with the air of a general reviewing her troops. Tommy, his tie slightly askew and his coffee cooling beside him, watched her with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. "Bills," Tuppence announced, flicking one envelope disdainfully into the reject pile. "Circulars, more circulars. Oh, look, a plea from the Society for Distressed Gentlewomen. You better take that one, Tommy. It suits your type." He grinned. "I'm not distressed. Yet. Though the electric bill might finish me off." Tuppence made a face and plucked up another envelope. "And this one?" She paused. It was different. Cream-coloured, heavy and sealed with wax. "Handwritten. Proper handwriting, too. None of your typewriter nonsense." She turned it over in her fingers. "From Cornwall." "Cornwall?" Tommy echoed. "Do we know anyone in Cornwall?" Tuppence shook her head. "Not unless one of your old girlfriends took up residence among the tin mines. But it's addressed to both of us. That's promising." She broke the seal carefully. She had a respect for mysteries, and drew out a single sheet of paper folded twice. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly at first, then slowed. Her expression shifted from curiosity to something sharper, more thoughtful. "Well," Tommy prompted, "has someone died and left us a castle?" "No castles," Tuppence said softly. "But listen to this." She began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, I trust you will forgive the liberty of a stranger addressing you, but I believe you once knew a young woman who called herself Jane Finn. Certain matters from that time were left unfinished, matters which, I fear, have now come to light again. I would be grateful if you could visit me at the Fallen Star Inn, Polglaze Cove, Cornwall. I am, in a sense, her debtor, and there are things I cannot leave unsaid. Yours sincerely, Althea Penruddock." Tuppence lowered the letter slowly, her gaze distant. "Jane Finn," she murmured. "It feels like another lifetime." Tommy leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You don't think—" "No, it's impossible. That business was wrapped up decades ago. What could anyone have left unsaid after all this time?" "That's exactly the sort of question one doesn't answer from an armchair," said Tuppence, her eyes brightening. "One goes and finds out." Tommy groaned. "You mean Cornwall?" "Exactly. Don't tell me you've lost your sense of adventure, Thomas Beresford. The coast, sea air, possibly smugglers, ghosts and long-buried secrets. It'll be practically a holiday." "Smugglers and ghosts are all very well," said Tommy, "but trains to Cornwall don't come with central heating, and I've grown fond of mine." She ignored him, already rummaging for the railway guide. "Polglaze Cove, I've heard of it. Tiny fishing village, cliffs, a ruined lighthouse. How romantic." "How damp," Tommy muttered. Tuppence shot him a look. "You're not curious about Mrs. Penruddock? She says she was Jane's debtor. What could that mean?" Tommy hesitated, then shrugged. "All right, I admit it. I am curious. But you realise Jane Finn would be, what, nearly 50? "Yes," said Tuppence softly. "And if she's not the one who sent this, someone wants us to think of her." The thought lingered like the smell of wet wool as they prepared for their journey. Tuppence insisted on packing both a mackintosh and an evening dress. You never know what one may require in Cornwall, while Tommy confined himself to the essentials and a pessimistic expression. Outside, the rain had thickened into a grey mist that turned London into a watercolour of umbrellas and cab wheels. By the time they reached Paddington, the world felt half a shade darker. They found their compartment, Tuppence settling near the window, watching droplets chase one another down the glass. Tommy unfolded the letter again. "Something left unfinished," he read aloud. "That's a dangerous phrase." Tuppence smiled faintly. "It's the best kind." The countryside slipped by in blurred shades of green and brown. The train rocked gently, its rhythm almost soothing. Tuppence dozed for a while, her head resting lightly against the seat back, and Tommy, watching her, felt the familiar tug of affection mingled with exasperation. He'd long ago learned that wherever Tuppence went, adventure followed, often with a revolver or two thrown in for good measure. They reached the junction at Bodmin by late afternoon. From there, a smaller train rattled toward the coast, the air turning sharper, tinged with salt. The guard, an elderly man with the weathered look of one who had outstared many storms, nodded when Tommy mentioned the Fallen Star Inn. "Aye," he said, "up on the cliffs above Polglaze. Been there longer than the lighthouse, though some say it oughtn't to be." "What do you mean?" Tuppence asked. He gave a slow shake of his head. "Strange goings-on in those parts, miss. Folk hear things, see lights where there oughtn't be any. But then, Cornwall's full of ghosts, they say." Tuppence exchanged a look with Tommy. "Charming," she murmured. By the time the train sighed into the last station, twilight had fallen. They found a cab waiting, a rattling, horse-drawn contraption that smelled faintly of seaweed, and climbed aboard. The road climbed steadily, winding through fields bounded by low stone walls slick with moss. Beyond them stretched the Atlantic, restless and grey, its waves striking the cliffs with hollow thunder. "There's your holiday," Tommy said, half smiling. "All it needs is a haunted innkeeper and a missing treasure." "Don't tempt fate," said Tuppence lightly, but her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where a single point of light flickered faintly, perhaps the remnant of the old lighthouse, or perhaps something else. They reached the inn just as the wind began to rise. It stood on the headland like a sentinel, its sign creaking on rusty hinges. The Fallen Star Inn, established 1804. The windows glowed dimly through the mist. As they approached, the front door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the threshold, a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," she called over the wind. Her voice was soft but carried easily. The lamplight behind her revealed delicate features lined with age, and eyes that held something between welcome and warning. "I am Althea Penruddock," she said. "You received my letter." Tuppence smiled, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "Indeed we did. We were most intrigued." Mrs. Penruddock inclined her head gravely. "Then come in. The sea is restless tonight, and I think perhaps it has brought you here for a reason." As the door closed behind them, and the sound of the waves faded, Tommy glanced at Tuppence. She gave him a look that said, quite clearly, "I told you so." The firelight flickered across the walls, and in its glow the adventure, whatever form it would take, had already begun. Later that evening, after they had dried their coats and taken a first grateful cup of tea, Mrs. Penruddock gathered the handful of guests by the fire. The Fallen Star's common room breathed peat and salt. Conversation flickered and fell like the flames. "You must forgive the company," she said, and began the introductions. Her voice was soft, cultured, with that particular Cornish music that turns every sentence into something half song, half warning. "Thank you," Tuppence said warmly. "We were charmed by your invitation." "I hope," said Mrs. Penruddock, "that you will not find your journey wasted." She paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward the sea. "This coast keeps its secrets well." Inside, the inn was unexpectedly comfortable, low-beamed ceilings, polished oak floors, and the glow of firelight pooling against the old stone hearth. The scent of peat and salt hung in the air. Yet beneath the warmth, Tuppence felt a faint unease, as though the walls themselves were listening. Mrs. Penruddock led them into the main hall where several guests lingered about the fire. "You must forgive the company," she said, with a hint of irony. "The Fallen Star attracts strays of all sorts." The first was a man in his 40s, lean and restless, with dark hair brushed carelessly back from a high forehead. He looked up from his notebook with a sardonic smile. "Mr. Lansing," said Mrs. Penruddock. "A writer." "Occasionally," he murmured, "when there's anything worth writing." His eyes lingered on Tuppence a moment too long before drifting back to the flames. Beside the hearth sat a stout gentleman in tweeds, the retired colonel, Mrs. Penruddock explained. His moustache bristled with authority, and he inclined his head curtly as though acknowledging comrades in arms. "Never thought I'd see visitors this time of year," he said. "The cliffs are treacherous in winter, but the view's grand, if you don't mind the occasional ghost story." Tommy grinned. "We're rather fond of ghost stories." The colonel's brow furrowed. "Careful what you wish for." A nervous maid appeared with tea, her hands trembling as she poured. Mrs. Penruddock introduced her as Elsie. She was pale, her eyes darting between guests as though fearful of someone's gaze, and in the corner, almost hidden by the curtain, sat a young woman in mourning black. She avoided their eyes, staring instead into her teacup. Her reflection trembled in the surface like a shadow in water. "She's staying for a short time," Mrs. Penruddock murmured, following Tuppence's glance. "Miss Allen. She prefers her privacy." As the evening drew on, conversation flickered and died like a struggling candle. The guests retired one by one, and Mrs. Penruddock showed the Beresfords to their room, a pleasant chamber with a wide window overlooking the sea. "The tide's rough tonight," she said. "Best keep the shutters fastened. The wind can be unsettling." She left them then, and her footsteps faded down the corridor. Tommy flung himself into a chair, loosening his tie. "Well, my dear, we've arrived. An inn full of strangers, a hostess with secrets, and a sea determined to drown us all. What more could you ask?" "Answers," said Tuppence quietly, "and perhaps a little less atmosphere." She crossed to the window. Outside, the fog was thicker now, the surf below pounding rhythmically against the cliffs. The glass rattled with each gust. Somewhere beyond, faint and far, a light flickered. Once, twice, then vanished. "Tommy," she said softly, "do you see that?" He came to stand beside her, peering through the gloom. Probably a fisherman's lantern. Perhaps, but her tone said she doubted it. "It came from the direction of the lighthouse ruins, didn't it?" Tommy frowned. "I thought that place had been abandoned years ago." "So did I," Tuppence murmured, "but it seems the past here isn't quite ready to stay buried." They stood there for a moment, listening to the wind batter the walls. Then Tuppence drew the curtains shut. "Come to bed," Tommy said lightly. "Tomorrow we'll begin our investigation, which will doubtless involve much tea and even more gossip." She smiled faintly. "And you'll pretend it's all nonsense until the moment it isn't." He grinned. "That's marriage." The fire hissed softly in the grate as they settled for the night. Outside, the sea thundered and the wind moaned across the cliffs, carrying with it a single faint echo, the toll of a distant bell from the direction of the lighthouse. It might have been the tide playing tricks, or it might have been the first whisper of the secret that waited for them at the edge of the world. The morning came reluctantly to the Cornish coast, a slow grey seep of light that touched the waves first, then the cliffs, and finally crept into the windows of the Fallen Star Inn. The wind had eased, but the sea still grumbled below, and gulls screamed like restless souls circling the edge of the world. Tuppence Beresford awoke to the sound of that wild chorus and the comforting smell of coffee. The fire in the small grate had been rekindled. Someone, perhaps the nervous maid, Elsie, had slipped in quietly during the dawn. Tommy was still half buried in the covers, muttering vague protests at the existence of morning. "Up you get," said Tuppence briskly. "We've mysteries to unravel." Tommy cracked one eye open. "The only mystery I'm concerned with is how breakfast finds its way to the dining room without drowning in this fog." "Adventure, darling," she replied, tying the sash of her dressing gown. "It starts with bacon and ends with a clue." By the time they descended to breakfast, the sitting room was alive with the peculiar hush of strangers obliged to share a table. The long windows looked out on the blurred expanse of sea and sky, indistinguishable in the mist. The smell of salt drifted in even with the windows latched. Mrs. Penruddock presided over the meal with the gentle melancholy of one long accustomed to silence. Her black gown was relieved only by a small silver brooch in the shape of a star. She greeted the Beresfords with warmth, but seemed distracted, as though her thoughts hovered elsewhere, perhaps somewhere out beyond the cliffs. The retired colonel was already seated, his napkin tucked in with military precision. "Morning, morning," he barked. "Bit of weather, eh? Keeps the weaklings indoors, what?" Then, without transition, his eyes unfocused and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. "I say, have they lit the lamp yet?" "The lamp?" Tommy asked. The colonel blinked and frowned. "The lighthouse, of course. Always did it early, before dark. Except that it's gone, hasn't it?" He gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "Confound it, must be losing my bearings." Mrs. Penruddock intervened smoothly. "The colonel served at the Admiralty once upon a time. The sea has a way of haunting those who knew it too well." "Haunting's the word," the colonel muttered. He subsided into his eggs with an air of having said too much. Opposite him, the writer, Mr. Lansing, was sketching something on the corner of a newspaper, a habit Tuppence had noticed the night before. He looked up now, catching her glance, and smiled thinly. "Forgive me," he said. "I was noting down a phrase that struck me. The sea remembers everything but forgives nothing. I may use it one day." "Perhaps in your next book?" Tuppence asked. He nodded. "If it ever ends. I seem cursed with unfinished stories." His tone was light, but there was an undercurrent of frustration. "This place has its own story, doesn't it, Mrs. Penruddock? One can feel it in the walls." Mrs. Penruddock's fingers tightened around her teacup. "You mustn't let your imagination run away with you, Mr. Lansing. The inn has stood for generations, and she prefers peace." Tuppence smiled politely, though she noted the flicker of fear behind their hostess's composure. After breakfast, while Tommy amused himself with a stroll along the cliff path, Tuppence lingered by the fire, feigning an interest in the framed nautical maps on the wall. Mrs. Penruddock joined her, and for a few moments they watched the waves silently. "You must find it lonely here," Tuppence ventured. "Lonely," Mrs. Penruddock repeated. "No, the sea keeps me company, and memories." She hesitated, then added quietly, "My husband built this place, you know, or rather rebuilt it. He said the name had history. The Fallen Star was once a signal house for ships running goods under the old excise laws." Tuppence's eyes brightened. "Smuggling?" A faint smile. "Perhaps. He liked to tease me with such tales, but he had a way of finding beauty in danger." Her expression clouded. "He died 10 years ago, a fall from the cliffs near the old lighthouse. The police called it an accident." "But you didn't," Tuppence said gently. Mrs. Penruddock looked into the fire. "No, he was troubled before he died. He spoke of debts, of old friends who were not what they seemed. Afterward I found strangers calling at the inn, asking odd questions. One even demanded to see the room at the end. I told him there was no such room to discourage him. It's been sealed for years." She gave a small, strained laugh. "At least, not that I've found." Tuppence studied her quietly. "You said your husband rebuilt the inn. Did he keep records, plans, accounts?" "There was a ledger," said Mrs. Penruddock after a pause. "It disappeared the day he died." Tuppence was about to reply when a shadow flickered past the door. The maid, Elsie, hovered with a tray, her hands trembling so badly that the crockery rattled. "Beg pardon, ma'am," she stammered. I thought—" "Elsie!" Mrs. Penruddock's tone snapped like a whip. "You're not to loiter. Go about your duties." The girl fled, nearly colliding with Tommy as he re-entered. "Well," he said cheerfully, "the wind's as bracing as you promised, and I've found a fine collection of bruises to prove it." He dropped into an armchair, holding out something wrapped in his handkerchief. "And look what turned up in our room." Tuppence took the object, an old photograph, sea-stained and faded. 5 men in uniform stood together, squinting into the sun. One of them, tall with the unmistakable air of command, looked disconcertingly like Mrs. Penruddock's late husband. "Where did you find it?" she asked. "In a secret compartment in the wardrobe," Tommy said. "False panel in the back. Bit of a trick to open." "That's odd," Tuppence murmured. "You'd think a place like this would have surrendered its secrets long ago." Tommy handed her a magnifying glass from his pocket, a habit he had acquired from his detective days and never abandoned. Together they examined the photograph. The uniforms were British Army, World War I, but something didn't fit. "Look at the date," Tuppence said, pointing to the margin where faint writing survived. "Ypres, 1919. But the war ended in 1918. Maybe someone miswrote it. Or maybe someone wanted us to think they did," she replied. "If this picture is genuine, it means Mr. Penruddock was somewhere he shouldn't have been, a year after the war, wearing a uniform he no longer had the right to wear." Tommy looked up thoughtfully. "And one of those other men might still be alive. Or here." From the hallway came the slow tread of footsteps. Mr. Lansing passed by, notebook in hand, humming under his breath. The colonel's voice drifted from the next room, murmuring indistinctly, something about signals at dusk. Tuppence folded the photograph carefully. "There's a pattern here, Tommy. The smuggling, the missing ledger, the strangers asking for a room that doesn't exist, all threads of the same tapestry." "And Mrs. Penruddock in the middle of it," Tommy added. "You think she's lying?" "I think," Tuppence said softly, "she's frightened. And people who are frightened sometimes tell lies without meaning to." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Somewhere down the corridor, a door slammed, though neither of them had heard anyone go by. Tommy stood, stretching. Well, old thing, we've got our mystery. Now all we need are suspects. Oh, we have plenty, said Tuppence, her eyes glinting, and if we stay long enough, the fallen star will show us which one shines least true. The storm arrived by noon, sliding in from the Atlantic like a grey curtain drawn across the sky. Wind howled around the eaves of the Fallen Star Inn, and the windows trembled under its assault. By afternoon, the sea had become a living thing, a vast, roaring beast hurling itself against the cliffs as if determined to swallow the land whole. Tuppence stood at the window, her reflection merging with the rain-streaked glass. "I think," she said quietly, "that Cornwall is not for the faint of heart." Tommy looked up from the hearth where he was attempting to coax a sulky fire into life. "Nor for those who hope to stroll along the beach. I can't see 10 feet beyond the garden wall. It's like being inside a kettle." She turned, the faintest smile playing on her lips. "Well then, we'll have to make our own entertainment. A good storm always brings secrets to the surface." He groaned. "Tuppence, whenever you say things like that, I end up wet, bruised, or both." But she was already moving toward the sitting room, curiosity lighting her eyes. The room was dim despite the lamps, filled with the smell of salt and old paper. Along one wall hung a series of nautical maps, their edges browned by age. She studied them idly at first, maps of tides, shipping routes, the shape of the Cornish coast as it twisted like a sleeping dragon, until something caught her eye. A faint glimmer, almost invisible, ran across the surface of one chart when the firelight flickered just so. Tuppence leaned closer. Someone, long ago, had written over the printed lines with a thin hand in fading ink. She traced the words slowly with her finger. "Seek the fallen star, truth beneath the sea." The phrase lodged like a burr in her mind, and when Elsie whispered later about the turning tide, it no longer sounded like superstition but a warning. She stepped back, heart quickening. "Tommy," she called softly, "come and look at this." He rose reluctantly, brushing ash from his sleeves, and joined her at the wall. "What do you make of it?" "I think," she said, "it's a message, hidden deliberately. Perhaps your Mr. Penruddock was more of a smuggler than his wife cared to admit." Tommy frowned. "Or someone wanted him to look for something under the sea. The fallen star could be literal. A shipwreck, perhaps." Tuppence smiled. "You see, darling, even you're catching the scent of adventure." Before he could reply, a timid knock came at the door. The maid, Elsie, stood in the doorway, pale and shivering though she carried a tray of tea. Her eyes darted nervously toward the window as another gust rattled the panes. "Beg pardon, miss," she whispered, "but it's bad luck, a storm like this. The tide's wrong. It'll turn sudden-like and—" She broke off, her gaze flicking toward the hallway as if afraid of being overheard. Tuppence stepped closer. "Yes, Elsie? What about the tide?" The girl swallowed hard, setting down the tray with shaking hands. "Don't stay here, that's all. Not while it's rising. Leave before it turns." "Elsie!" Mrs. Penruddock's voice cut sharply from the doorway. She stood there, her shawl clutched tightly around her. "You're frightening our guests." The maid dropped into a curtsy. "Oh, sorry, Ma'am, I didn't mean—" "Go back to the kitchen." Elsie vanished as quickly as she'd come. Mrs. Penruddock turned to them with a brittle smile. "You must forgive her. Country superstitions. The servants love their drama." Tuppence's tone was mild, but her eyes were watchful. "What sort of superstitions?" "Oh, the usual nonsense. Ghost ships, cursed tides. They say the sea keeps what it takes, and perhaps they're right." She paused, her gaze lingering on the map behind Tuppence. "I should put those away. My husband was rather fond of them." "Fascinating man, by all accounts," said Tommy lightly. Mrs. Penruddock gave a faint, strained laugh. "Yes, fascinating, and far too curious for his own good." After she left, Tommy turned to his wife. "Well, that's encouraging. What next? Tea with the ghost of the late Mr. Penruddock?" But Tuppence was staring thoughtfully at the tray Elsie had left. Between the cups lay a folded scrap of paper, half hidden under the sugar bowl. She palmed it quickly before Tommy could notice, unfolding it only after the door closed behind them. The handwriting was shaky, blotted by moisture, but the message was clear enough. "Leave before the tide turns." She tucked it into her sleeve. "Tommy," she said calmly, "I think you should visit the post office." The post office? In this weather? Yes, that photograph we found, the one with Mrs. Penruddock's husband. Ask if he's still been receiving letters. Just a hunch. He sighed dramatically, reaching for his coat. You do realize this is the sort of hunch that ends with pneumonia. Bring back a clue, and I'll bring you brandy, she said sweetly. It took him nearly an hour to return. When he did, his hat was soaked and his expression wary. He shut the door firmly behind him before speaking. Well, my dear Sherlock, he said, your hunch was half right. The postmaster remembers a letter, sent only last month, addressed to a Captain Penruddock. Tuppence blinked. But her husband's been dead 10 years. Exactly. The sender's name was blurred, foreign, possibly French, but the postmark was local. Someone here in this very village wrote to a man they knew was dead. She was silent for a long moment, then said softly, The sea keeps what it takes, but perhaps not everything. Evening fell early. The storm showed no sign of relenting. Guests gathered uneasily in the sitting room, pretending at sociability while the wind keened through the chimneys. The colonel nodded off in his chair, muttering about patrol lights and codes. The young woman in black stared fixedly into the fire, her hands clenched on her lap. Mr. Lancing prowled restlessly by the window, his notebook forgotten on the mantelpiece. Can't write in weather like this, he muttered. One feels watched, as though the storm itself were listening. Mrs. Penruddock, pale and distracted, tried to maintain her composure. When she rose to retire, Lancing followed her into the corridor. Their voices, low at first, began to rise. You lied to me, he hissed. You said it was destroyed. I told you the truth, she snapped. You're tormenting yourself over shadows. I saw it. The ledger. You can't hide it forever. There was a sharp crash, the sound of something breaking, then silence. Tuppence, who had risen halfway from her chair, looked at Tommy. Stay here, he whispered. I'll see what's what. He slipped into the corridor, but when he reached the landing it was empty. Only a faint scent of sea air lingered, damp and unmistakable. Nothing, he said quietly when he returned. Not a sign of either of them. They waited through the uneasy night. The storm raged on until just before dawn, when it died as suddenly as it had come. A pale light filtered through the mist, revealing the sea calm and gleaming as though nothing had happened at all. But when Mrs. Penruddock descended to breakfast, her face was white as salt. Mr. Lancing, she said faintly, is gone. They found his room empty, his bed unslept in. The only trace of him lay at the threshold, a line of wet footprints leading from the corridor to the back door and out toward the cliffs. The prints stopped at the edge, where the grass gave way to rock. Below, the tide rolled gently, indifferent. Tuppence stood beside Tommy, staring down at the sea that had swallowed another secret. Seek the fallen star, she murmured, the truth beneath the sea. Tommy slipped his hand into hers. Let's hope, he said quietly, it hasn't taken the truth down with him. Dawn came reluctantly to the Cornish cliffs, grey and thin as cigarette smoke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a restless calm, a world washed clean but uneasy, as though something vital had been swept away with the night. The sea below still heaved and sighed, flecks of white foam tracing the jagged rocks where Mr. Lancing had last been seen. Tommy Beresford stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, staring toward the horizon. A pair of coastguards clambered over the rocks below, their figures small and uncertain against the vastness of the sea. Tuppence stood beside him, her scarf pulled tight against the chill. "They've found nothing?" she asked. "Not a thing," Tommy replied grimly. "No hat, no coat, no body. The man's vanished into thin air, or rather, thick fog." She glanced toward the inn, its slate roof glistening faintly with dew. "And yet someone saw a man walking away from the cliffs." "Yes," Tommy said. "The local fisherman swears by it. Tall fellow in a dark coat," he said. "Could be anyone, or no one." He sighed, turning from the sea. "If Lancing is alive, he's keeping very quiet about it. And if he's dead, well, the Atlantic doesn't give back its secrets easily." They returned to the inn in silence. The atmosphere inside was worse than the weather, a kind of watchful stillness that made every creak of the floorboards seem significant. Mrs. Penruddock greeted them in the hall, her face composed but her eyes shadowed. "The Coast Guard has been and gone," she said softly. "They think he slipped in the storm." Tuppence looked at her closely. "Do they? And what do you think, Mrs. Penruddock?" The older woman's hands tightened on the folds of her shawl. "I think the sea keeps its own." Her answer might have ended there, but the Colonel's voice came suddenly from behind them, low and irritable. "The dead don't stay buried long in these parts," he said. "Not in Cornwall. The sea throws back what it doesn't want." Tuppence turned to look at him. "You seem very sure of that, Colonel." He shrugged, his moustache twitching. "Old tales, smugglers, wreckers, ghosts. But mark my words, things have a way of coming home here." Mrs. Penruddock cut him off with a brittle laugh. "Superstitions! Don't fill our guests' heads with nonsense, Colonel." But her tone was too sharp, her smile too thin. Tuppence caught the tremor in her hand as she poured tea, and the way her gaze lingered, just for a heartbeat, on the empty chair by the fire where Lancing had sat the previous night. Later that morning, while Mrs. Penruddock busied herself in the kitchen and the Colonel dozed in the lounge, Tommy wandered into the small parlour at the far end of the hall. It was an oddly furnished room, part sitting area, part relic display. The rain-streaked windows faced the sea, and a grand piano stood by the wall, its varnish dulled by years of salt air. Tommy idly lifted the lid and tapped a few keys. The sound was dull and off-key, but something about the bench beneath caught his attention. When he sat down, the seat dipped unevenly, too much weight on one side. Curiosity pricked. He lifted the cushion and found a small compartment hollowed out underneath. Inside lay a slim black notebook, damp around the edges as though it had been handled with wet hands. "Well, well," he murmured, flipping it open. The handwriting was unmistakably Lancing's, firm, slanted, a little theatrical. But the contents were stranger still. Pages of sketches and coded notes. Star charts mostly. Constellations mapped in careful ink, annotated with odd remarks. At the centre of several pages was one word, written again and again: Canopus. "The fallen star," Tommy read aloud. He turned another page. Below the sketches was a curious phrase: "The ledger hides where the star fell." Tuppence entered then, her curiosity instantly catching on his expression. "What have you unearthed this time?" He handed her the notebook. "Lancing's, hidden in the piano bench. It seems he fancied himself an astronomer, or a code breaker." Tuppence turned the pages slowly, her brow furrowing. Canopus. That's the second brightest star in the night sky. But why would he call it the fallen star? Tommy leaned against the piano. Perhaps it's not the star that fell. Perhaps it's something named for it. A ship, maybe. A clue to whatever Penruddock was mixed up in. Tuppence smiled faintly. "You're improving, darling. A little less skepticism, a little more imagination." "Yes, but I still prefer solid ground beneath my feet," he said. "All this talk of stars and secrets under the sea makes me seasick." They both looked up as footsteps approached. Mrs. Penruddock stood in the doorway, her eyes flicking to the notebook in Tuppence's hands. For a moment, something like panic crossed her face, quickly masked by politeness. "Ah, you found one of Mr. Lancing's things," she said, voice tight. "He was always scribbling." "Indeed," Tuppence replied mildly, though his scribbles seem oddly specific. Constellations, coordinates, codes. Mrs. Penruddock's fingers twisted together. "You shouldn't trouble yourself with them. The man was imaginative." "Of course," said Tommy lightly, "though I do wonder why he hid his imagination in a piano bench." She made a small sound, half laugh, half sigh. "You mustn't read meaning into everything, Mr. Beresford. The human mind invents mysteries where none exist." Tuppence met her gaze. "Sometimes, yes, but sometimes the mind merely recognizes what it already suspects." Mrs. Penruddock paled. "You're very perceptive, Mrs. Beresford." Then, with sudden decision, she turned away. "Excuse me, I must see to the household." After she had gone, Tommy exhaled. "If she's not hiding something, I'll eat your hat." "You'd better hope you're wrong," Tuppence said. "It's the only one you brought." The rest of the day passed under a peculiar tension. The guests moved about like figures in a play, the Colonel pacing the corridor, muttering about patrols, the young woman in black vanishing for hours on end, Elsie appearing only when summoned, her eyes downcast. By evening, the weather had changed again. The sky was streaked with bruised gold and purple as the sun sank into the sea. Tommy and Tuppence dined quietly, exchanging glances whenever Mrs. Penruddock's hands trembled or the Colonel's fork scraped against his plate. When they retired to their room, Tuppence moved to check their luggage, a habit born of long experience in untrustworthy lodgings. She paused, frowning. "Tommy, did you open the valise?" He looked up from the hearth. "No. Why?" "Because someone else did." The case had been disturbed, clothes shifted, papers crumpled. Nothing appeared to be missing, yet something about the disorder was deliberate, almost mocking. And then she saw it, resting neatly atop the folded garments, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. A single gold cufflink. She picked it up carefully. It was heavy, engraved with a crest she didn't recognize, a star encircled by a serpent. Tommy whistled softly. "Well, that's not mine." "Nor Lansing's," said Tuppence. "He wore plain ones." They exchanged a look. "A warning?" he suggested. "Or an invitation," she said. "Either way, it's a message." Tommy examined the cufflink under the light. "You know, this crest looks familiar. I saw something like it carved into the wood panelling in the hallway, near that locked door Mrs. Penruddock claims leads to the storeroom." Tuppence's eyes brightened. "Then tomorrow, darling, we go exploring." Tommy smiled ruefully. "And here I thought we might finally get a quiet night." Tuppence placed the cufflink on the bedside table, its golden star catching the firelight. "At the fallen star," she said softly, "there's no such thing as a quiet night." Outside, the wind picked up once more, carrying with it the faint echo of the sea's endless murmur, as if whispering secrets that only the dead, or those brave enough to listen, could ever understand. The tide was out when they left the inn, a dull pewter morning with the promise of rain hanging heavy in the air. The cliffs stretched before them like the spine of some ancient creature, slick with mist and seaweed. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and mournful. Tuppence Beresford led the way, her boots crunching over the wet stones. Tommy followed, grumbling good-naturedly, collar turned up against the wind. "Remind me again," he said, "why we're trudging out to a ruin that looks as though it's been waiting 100 years to fall on someone's head." "Because," said Tuppence, her eyes bright beneath the brim of her hat, "people don't hide ledgers full of secrets in safe, well-lit places. They hide them where only the foolish or the brave would look." Tommy muttered something about marriage to both kinds, but he lengthened his stride to keep pace. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a gaunt skeleton of stone perched on the edge of the headland. Its lantern room was shattered, its walls crumbling, but it still held a strange, stubborn dignity against the sea's assault. As they approached, the wind dropped suddenly, and the air seemed to thicken. Even the gulls fell silent. "Cheerful spot," Tommy said. "I can see why people don't holiday here." Tuppence smiled faintly. "This was once a signal post, you know, part of the old smuggling routes. If the Fallen Star Inn was the front, this would have been the lookout." He glanced at her. "You've been reading too many adventure stories." "Possibly," she said, "but adventure stories don't usually leave footprints." Tommy stopped. Sure enough, in the damp sand just outside the ruined doorway, a series of prints led inward, fresh, narrow, and unmistakably recent. "Well," he said softly, "either someone else shares your taste in archaeology, or we've got company." The doorway gaped before them, half blocked by fallen stone. Inside, the air smelled of salt, oil, and decay. Their footsteps echoed as they entered, and the sea boomed faintly below through cracks in the foundation. A beam of light pierced the gloom, Tuppence's torch. Its narrow circle revealed the remnants of a wooden table, a rusted lantern, and a heap of old rope. Beside the table, a small patch of sand was disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently. "There," she whispered, pointing. "The footprints end by that wall." Tommy knelt, brushing aside grit. His hand struck something hard. "Well, I'll be—" He tugged, and a small oilskin bundle came free. It was a ledger, thick, its cover stained but intact, wrapped carefully against the damp. "Now that," said Tuppence, "wasn't left here by accident." They carried it to the window, where grey light filtered through the cracks. Tuppence unwrapped it gently. The pages inside were filled with neat, slanted handwriting, numbers, initials, fragments of code. Some pages were smudged, others blank, but one stood out. Across the top, in larger letters than the rest, was scrawled, "The Exchange, 1918. Beneath it, a list of names, English and foreign alike, some crossed through, others underlined. And near the bottom, one name leapt out at them both. "Jane Finn," Tuppence breathed. For a moment the world seemed to still. The wind, the sea, even the distant cry of gulls, all faded. Tommy exhaled slowly. "It can't be, after all these years." "It is," she said quietly. "The same handwriting, the same era. And 1918, the end of the war. This is what Mrs. Penruddock meant by unfinished business. Her husband was involved in something to do with Jane Finn's case." He frowned at the page. But what was the exchange, and why list Jane's name among these? Tuppence's brow furrowed. Perhaps the secret papers weren't the only thing she was mixed up in. Or perhaps someone kept a record of everyone connected with that affair, on both sides. She turned another page, scanning rapidly. There are initials next to each entry, and dates. Look, some go beyond the war years. 1920, 1923. That's long after it should have ended. Which means whatever started in 1918 didn't end there, Tommy said. It carried on, quietly. Tuppence looked around the room. And if this ledger was hidden here, someone meant to find it later. He nodded slowly. But maybe Lansing found it first. They shared a look, the unspoken thought between the two that Lansing's disappearance was no accident. Tuppence began examining the ledger's cover. It feels thicker than it should. There's something inside the binding. Tommy passed her his penknife. She worked the blade carefully along the spine. With a soft tear, a narrow panel of wood came loose, revealing a small compartment hidden in the back cover. Inside lay a locket, tarnished and green with age. Tuppence opened it gently. Inside, under the cracked glass, was a tiny photograph, the face of a young woman smiling faintly, her hair pinned up in a wartime style. On the opposite side, a small insignia, an eagle clutching a cross unmistakably German. "Good heavens," whispered Tommy. "That's not Jane Finn, is it?" Tuppence studied it. No. Similar age, but not her. Perhaps a connection, a friend, or a spy contact. She turned the locket over. Etched faintly on the back were the initials AP and the date 1918. "Althea Penruddock," Tuppence said softly. They looked at each other. "So she was involved," Tommy murmured. "All this time. She's been hiding more than grief." Tuppence slipped the locket into her pocket. "If this ties her to the ledger, we'll need to confront her. But not yet." A sudden sound made them both freeze, the faint crunch of gravel outside. Tommy extinguished the torch at once. They crouched in the half-light listening. Footsteps. Slow, cautious, moving toward the entrance. "Someone followed us," Tuppence whispered. Tommy glanced around, but the lighthouse offered little cover, only the shadow of the fallen stairway. The door creaked slightly, letting in a sliver of daylight and the faint outline of a figure just beyond the threshold. "Stay quiet," he murmured. The figure moved closer, a silhouette against the light. It paused as if listening, then turned its head sharply toward them. Tuppence's heart pounded. She could see now the glint of something metallic in the stranger's hand. Not a weapon, but perhaps a lantern. Then, abruptly, the floor beneath them groaned. "Tommy!" He didn't wait for her to finish. "Run!" The next second, the far wall gave way with a deafening crack. A shower of rock and sand crashed down, filling the air with dust. They stumbled toward the door as the floor split behind them, half the structure sliding toward the sea with a roar like thunder. Tommy seized her hand, dragging her through the doorway just as the upper wall collapsed, sending debris tumbling past their heels. They ran blindly into the open air, coughing, the taste of salt and stone on their tongues. When at last they stopped, the lighthouse was half gone, the lower rooms swallowed by the cliffside, the rest leaning perilously toward the surf below. "Well," Tommy said hoarsely, "that's one way to keep a secret buried." Tuppence brushed dust from her coat, chest heaving. Someone triggered that deliberately. The timing was too exact. He looked back at the ruin, and whoever it was, they didn't stick around to help. "Which means," she said, "they knew what we'd found." They stood for a moment, the sea wind tearing at their clothes. Below, the tide had begun to turn, creeping back toward the rocks. Tommy wiped his forehead. So what now? We've got a ledger full of codes, a locket linking our hostess to espionage, and a collapsing lighthouse for our troubles. Tuppence smiled faintly, though her eyes were sharp. Now, my dear husband, we go back to the inn, pretend nothing happened, and wait for whoever tried to kill us to make their next move. He gave her a look of resigned admiration. Sometimes I wonder if I married a detective or a daredevil. Both, she said cheerfully. And don't forget, dinner's at 7. As they started back along the cliff path, the clouds broke briefly, and the setting sun bled crimson across the sea. The remains of the lighthouse stood silhouetted against the light, half in shadow, half in flame. It looked, Tuppence thought, exactly like its name, a fallen star. Morning broke with deceptive gentleness, the kind Cornwall does best after a storm, a veil of mist over the sea, sunlight glancing through it like gold dust. The Fallen Star Inn looked peaceful from the outside, its windows glimmering faintly with dew, its chimneys sending up thin blue threads of smoke. Yet inside, unease clung to the air like damp wool. Tommy and Tuppence came down late, both weary from the previous day's narrow escape at the lighthouse. The fire in the dining room was already lit, casting a fragile warmth over the table where Mrs. Penruddock and the Colonel were seated. "Good morning," Mrs. Penruddock greeted them with a forced brightness. "You missed the sunrise. Quite extraordinary. The sea looked like molten silver." "Splendid," said Tommy dryly, hanging his coat on the stand. "We were otherwise occupied with the memory of collapsing architecture." Mrs. Penruddock's cup paused halfway to her lips. "You went to the lighthouse?" Tuppence smiled faintly. "Oh, we only admired it from a distance, or what's left of it." The Colonel chuckled, though his face was grey with fatigue. "That place is cursed," he said. "I told you, didn't I, Mrs. Beresford? The sea takes what it wants." "Still," said Tuppence gently, taking her seat, "one mustn't let superstition get the better of sense." The Colonel grunted. "Superstition, is it? Then what do you make of Lansing's vanishing, or the whispering at night?" He leaned closer. "You've heard it, haven't you? Voices when the wind drops." "Probably the plumbing," Tommy offered. But the Colonel wasn't listening. His eyes had gone unfocused again, as they sometimes did. "They're watching," he muttered. "Always watching." Mrs. Penruddock placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Please, Colonel, drink your tea. You need rest, not talk of ghosts." He obeyed, though his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. The sound of the kitchen door opening broke the tension. Elsie appeared with a tray of eggs and toast. She looked worse than ever, pale, hollow-eyed, her hands shaking. When her eyes met Tuppence's, something like fear passed between them. Tuppence gave a small, reassuring nod, but the girl turned quickly away, nearly spilling the teapot as she poured for Tommy. "Steady on," said Tommy with a half-smile. "You'll have me swimming in laps of Darjeeling." "Sorry, sir," Elsie whispered. Mrs. Penruddock sighed. "The storm's unsettled everyone. Sit down a moment, Elsie. You look fit to faint." But the maid shook her head and retreated to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she went. The conversation drifted after that. Weather, rationing, some idle comment about the train service. Yet beneath the clatter of cutlery, tension hummed. Tommy noticed that Mrs. Penruddock was restless, her gaze flicking often toward the hallway. "Expecting someone?" he asked. She started slightly. "The post. He's always here by 10, rain or shine." "Dependable fellow," Tommy said lightly. "One hates to lose a good postman." But Tuppence saw what Tommy did not, the way Mrs. Penruddock's fingers clenched tightly around her napkin. Then, without warning, the Colonel gave a low gasp. His cup rattled against the saucer, tea spilling across the white linen. He tried to speak, failed, and slumped forward. "Colonel!" Mrs. Penruddock cried, leaping to her feet. Tommy was already beside the man, loosening his collar, checking for a pulse. Tuppence went to the door and called sharply for Elsie. Moments later the maid appeared, white as chalk. "Oh no! Oh, not him! Fetch the doctor," Tuppence ordered. "Now!" The girl fled. Mrs. Penruddock knelt beside the Colonel, her composure crumbling. He was just speaking. He seemed—" Tommy shook his head. "He's gone." For a long moment there was silence, only the faint ticking of the clock and the hiss of the fire. Then Mrs. Penruddock rose slowly, hands pressed to her mouth. "Dear God," she whispered, Not again. The local doctor arrived within the hour, a brisk man smelling faintly of iodine and pipe smoke. He examined the body with professional detachment, then turned to the assembled group. Mrs. Penruddock, Tommy, Tuppence, and a trembling Elsie. "Poison," he said simply, fast-acting, likely in the tea. Mrs. Penruddock swayed, and Tuppence caught her arm. "Are you certain, Doctor?" He nodded grimly. "I'll send word to the constable. No one leaves the premises." After he departed, the inn fell into uneasy silence. Rain began again, soft but relentless, tapping against the windows like a watchful hand. Tuppence sat near the fire, studying the scene. Mrs. Penruddock had retreated to a corner, her face hidden in her hands. Elsie hovered by the door, wringing her apron. Tommy paced the length of the room. "Well, this settles it," he said. "Our quiet seaside holiday has officially turned into a murder investigation." Tuppence's voice was calm. "We'd better start with who had access to the tea." Elsie spoke up suddenly, her voice shaking. "It wasn't me, Ma'am. I swear it. I brewed the pot same as always. I didn't touch his cup." "No one's accusing you," Tuppence said gently. "But tell us, did the Colonel seem upset this morning?" Elsie hesitated. "He was muttering again, Ma'am, saying as how they'd come for him next. And when I brought in the tray, he looked at me like he knew something." Her eyes filled with tears. "He knew too much. That's what he said last night." Tuppence leaned forward. "He said that to you?" "Yes, Ma'am. I didn't understand what he meant, but he was frightened." Before Tuppence could reply, Tommy returned from the hallway holding something in his hand, a scrap of paper, torn unevenly. "Found this in the Colonel's jacket pocket," he said. "Half a telegram," he read aloud. "Retrieve the ledger before they do." Tuppence and Mrs. Penruddock exchanged a glance. "The ledger," Mrs. Penruddock whispered. Then he knew. "Knew what, exactly?" asked Tommy. Her lips trembled. "My husband's ledger. I told you it disappeared after his death, but if the Colonel was searching for it—" She broke off, turning away. "This is all my fault. I should have burned those papers years ago." Tuppence watched her carefully. "You mean you had access to them?" Mrs. Penruddock looked stricken. "Only once. My husband left notes. Fragments. I didn't understand them." Tommy crossed his arms. "And now 2 men are dead or missing because of those fragments." The older woman flinched. "You think I—" "No," said Tuppence firmly. "But someone here does." Elsie began to sob quietly. "Please, Ma'am, I can't stay. Not after this. The Colonel said I was next." Mrs. Penruddock turned sharply. "Nonsense. You'll stay where you are." "But he said—" "That's enough!" The sudden edge in her voice silenced the room. Tuppence noticed for the first time the streak of pale clay along the hem of Mrs. Penruddock's shoes, the same peculiar colour as the earth around the lighthouse. She rose slowly, her tone mild. "You've been out walking this morning?" Mrs. Penruddock blinked, startled. "What? No, I've barely left the house." "Strange," said Tuppence. "That clay isn't found anywhere near the inn, only along the cliffs." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. Then Mrs. Penruddock looked away. "You must be mistaken." Tommy stepped closer, voice low. "We were at the lighthouse yesterday, remember? That same mud clings to one's shoes like guilt." Mrs. Penruddock turned sharply toward him, her composure fraying. "You have no right." "Perhaps not," said Tuppence evenly. "But someone's been there since we left. The footprints were fresh." Elsie whimpered. "Please stop. You don't understand." "Then make us," said Tuppence softly. "Tell us what you know." The girl's face crumpled. "It was Mr. Lansing," she whispered. "Before he disappeared, he made me promise to watch Mrs. Penruddock. He said she'd been meeting someone by the cliffs, after dark." Mrs. Penruddock went white. "That's a lie." Tommy looked at her steadily. "Is it? Because that pale clay says otherwise." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with visible effort, Mrs. Penruddock drew herself upright. "You think I poisoned the Colonel? That I killed Lansing? You don't understand, Mr. Beresford. My husband's work—" "Was espionage," Tuppence finished quietly. "We've read the ledger." Her eyes widened in horror. "You went there? Oh, God! Then you've put yourselves in danger." "From whom?" Tommy asked. But Mrs. Penruddock only shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't know what you've unearthed." Some things should have died with him. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like a warning. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, as though the old inn itself were listening. Tommy looked down at the Colonel's untouched cup, the faint residue of tea staining the porcelain. "Poisoned tea," he said softly. "A message to anyone who asks too many questions." Tuppence's voice was steady. "Then we'll have to be the ones who don't stop asking." And as the storm swelled once more over the Cornish cliffs, the Fallen Star Inn settled deeper into silence, a house holding its breath, waiting for the next secret to surface. It was one of those nights when silence feels heavier than sound. The sea was calm at last, a dark mirror beneath a low, waning moon. The Fallen Star Inn slept under a thin mist, its chimneys breathing faint trails of smoke into the chill air. Yet inside, behind shuttered windows and drawn curtains, unease lingered like a scent that refused to fade. Tommy Beresford lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the walls the wind whispered, not howling now, but sighing, as if carrying words it could not quite form. He turned toward Tuppence, who was sleeping lightly beside him, one hand resting near the lamp. They had retired early, exhausted from the day's chaos, yet sleep had come for neither of them easily. He was just drifting into that uneasy space between wakefulness and dreams when a sound came, faint, deliberate, unmistakable. Footsteps in the corridor, not the casual tread of a guest returning late, nor the creak of settling wood, but slow, measured steps that stopped directly outside their door. Tommy held his breath. He saw the shadow fall beneath the crack of the door, a sliver of darkness interrupting the faint light from the hallway. Then, very quietly, something slid across the floorboards, a soft scrape, paper against wood. The shadow moved again, and was gone. Tommy was out of bed in a heartbeat, pulling his dressing gown tight. Tuppence stirred instantly. She had the instincts of a cat when it came to midnight disturbances. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone just delivered the post rather later than usual." He bent, retrieved an envelope, and held it up to the lamplight. No address, no seal, only a single word scrawled across the front, "For you both." Tuppence sat up, her eyes sharp despite the dimness. How very considerate of them. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a page ripped from the missing ledger. The writing was identical to what they had seen before, rows of coded entries and names. But this page bore one phrase circled in dark ink, Polglazed Chapel, beneath the stone star, and tucked behind it, a small brass key, tied with twine and marked with an old-fashioned paper tag, Room 7. Tuppence met his gaze. "Someone wants us to find something." "Or walk straight into a trap," Tommy said. "Possibly, but then traps have a way of revealing who sets them." They dressed quickly, moving with practiced quiet. The corridor outside was cold and smelled faintly of smoke and sea air. A lamp burned low at the far end, throwing long shadows along the wainscoting. Room 7 lay at the end of the hall, the one door they'd never seen open. Mrs. Penruddock had once mentioned it was out of order, though she'd never said why. The key fit easily, the lock turning with a soft click. Tommy hesitated a moment before pushing the door open. The air inside was stale, tinged with dust and something metallic, gun oil perhaps. The curtains were half drawn, moonlight spilling across the floor in silver pools. A writing desk stood by the window, papers scattered as if someone had left in haste. Tuppence crossed to the desk, her eyes scanning the surface. "Look at this." Pinned beneath a paperweight was a map of Europe, hand-marked with lines and symbols, tiny red stars, black circles, and faint pencil routes connecting coastal points. She traced one with her fingertip. "Smuggling routes, or perhaps wartime courier paths. See here, Dover to Brittany, Lisbon to Cornwall." "And this?" Tommy held up a letter, the paper thin and yellowed. The handwriting was elegant, but the language was German. Tuppence took it from him, reading aloud slowly, translating as she went. "The exchange will take place under Canopus. The star that falls will mark the end." She looked up, brow furrowed. "That name again, the Fallen Star. It's more than a poetic code, it's a system." Tommy turned toward the dresser, and stopped. Resting there, half hidden beneath a folded newspaper, was a revolver. He picked it up carefully, sniffed the barrel. "Recently fired," he said grimly. "Within the last day, I'd say." They shared a look. Before either could speak, a voice rang out behind them, trembling, urgent. "What are you doing in here?" They spun around. Mrs. Penruddock stood in the doorway, her dressing gown clutched tight, her face deathly pale. "Mrs. Penruddock," Tuppence began, "someone slipped this under our door, the key, and a page from your husband's ledger." The woman swayed slightly as though struck by a chill. "You shouldn't be here. You don't understand. He's back." Tommy blinked. "Who's back?" "Lancing," she whispered. "I saw him, just now, at the cliffside window, standing there looking in." Her voice broke. His coat was wet, and he was smiling. Tuppence rose slowly. "You're sure it was him?" "He's dead," Mrs. Penruddock whispered. "He must be, but I saw him." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. "All right," he said quietly. "Show us." They followed her through the corridor and down the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing faintly. The house felt even larger in the dark, the fire in the sitting room long since gone cold. Mrs. Penruddock led them to the drawing room, the one that looked out over the cliffs. The curtains were half open, the window slightly ajar, letting in the damp sea wind. "There," she said, pointing. "He was right there, staring in." Tommy crossed to the window, peering out into the mist. The moon had vanished behind a cloud, leaving the world in shades of grey. The waves below gleamed faintly, but beyond that, nothing. "No one now," he said. Tuppence leaned out, scanning the ground below with her torch. "Wait, look." Footprints. Fresh, sharp impressions in the soft earth just beyond the window. They led away toward the cliffs. "Either your ghost has substance," Tommy murmured, "or we're being haunted by someone with very solid boots." Mrs. Penruddock's voice trembled. "He wants the ledger back. He'll kill to get it." Tuppence turned from the window. "Mrs. Penruddock, did your husband ever mention Polglase Chapel?" The woman blinked, startled. "Yes, once. He said it was the first signal post before the inn was built. Why?" Tuppence showed her the note from the envelope. "Because someone wants us to look there, beneath the stone star." Mrs. Penruddock's face drained of colour. "Then God help us all," she whispered. A distant sound broke the silence, a faint clang, like metal against stone, carried on the wind. Tommy grabbed a lantern. "Stay here," he said, but Mrs. Penruddock caught his arm. "No, don't go down there. The ground's treacherous. You'll fall like the others." But Tuppence was already at the door. "If there's something to be found, we can't afford to wait." The night air hit them like cold silk. The path to the cliffs was slick, the earth soft beneath their boots. The faint beam of Tommy's lantern cut through the fog, picking out shapes that seemed to move. Bushes, rocks, the skeletal outline of the old chapel further ahead. The ruin stood on a rise overlooking the sea, its roof long gone, walls half swallowed by ivy. Once it might have been beautiful. Now it looked like a monument to forgotten sins. They reached the doorway, breath misting in the cold. Inside, the lantern revealed broken pews and a cracked stone altar. Above it, carved deep into the wall, was a 5-pointed star. Tuppence stepped closer, tracing its edges. This must be it, the fallen star. Tommy examined the floor. "There's something odd here. This slab's newer than the rest." They knelt, pushing aside loose earth and seaweed. Beneath the slab was a hollow space, and within it, a small metal box, rusted but intact. Tuppence lifted it out carefully. "It's the same crest as the cufflink, the serpent and star." Tommy pried it open. Inside were documents, yellowed papers stamped with military seals, correspondence in German and English, and a small photograph of a man in uniform standing beside a younger version of Mrs. Penruddock's husband. Tuppence's eyes widened. They were part of a covert network, British officers exchanging intelligence through smuggling routes. "And Lancing knew," Tommy said grimly. "That's why he came here. The ledger proved it. Names, exchanges, betrayals. Enough to ruin reputations even now." A sound behind them froze them both, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Tuppence turned sharply. "Who's there?" Only silence answered, and then, from the mist beyond the chapel, the faint glimmer of movement, a shadow watching. Tommy took a step forward, raising the lantern high. "Show yourself!" For a heartbeat, the light caught a face, pale, wet, unmistakably human, before vanishing into the fog. They ran after it, down the narrow path that curved toward the sea, but when they reached the edge there was nothing, only the wind, the endless dark, and a single set of footprints leading down toward the rocks. Tuppence stared after them, breathless. Not a ghost after all. "No," Tommy said quietly, "but close enough." He looked back toward the chapel where the carving of the star glimmered faintly in the moonlight. "The fallen star," Tuppence murmured. "A code, a place and a promise, one that still hasn't been kept." And as they turned back toward the inn, the fog swallowed the path behind them, as if erasing every trace of the night's visitor, leaving only the echo of the sea and the memory of a man who might, or might not, have ever truly died. The first light of dawn found Cornwall half veiled in mist. The tide, drawn back like a breath held too long, revealed its secrets grudgingly, tangles of seaweed, wrecked timber, and the glint of things that had no business being there. The Fallen Star Inn slept uneasily on the cliff above, its chimneys breathing thin smoke into the chill morning air, while the gulls cried over the restless surf below. Tommy Beresford stood at the edge of the headland, hands in his pockets, peering down where the sea had retreated. "Well," he said quietly, "if there was ever a day for buried treasure, this would be it." Tuppence joined him, her coat buttoned high against the wind. "Not treasure," she murmured. "Evidence. The sea has been keeping everyone's secrets. Now it's giving one back." The coast guards were already there, 2 men in rough oilskins, hauling something heavy from the sand. As they dragged it clear of the surf, Tommy and Tuppence descended the rocky path to meet them. It was a chest, small but solid, its surface crusted with salt and rust. One of the men gave it a final heave onto dry ground and straightened, panting. "Found her wedged between the rocks," he said. "Could have been there for years, or yesterday. Hard to say." Tuppence crouched beside it. Despite the corrosion, she could make out a faint design carved into the lid, a serpent coiled around a star. She caught Tommy's eye. "The same crest," she said, "as the cufflink." Tommy nodded grimly. "Looks like the serpent's been guarding something after all." They pried it open with a crowbar borrowed from the guard's kit. The hinges groaned, then gave way with a metallic snap. Inside, the smell of brine and age rose like a ghost, sea-soaked paper, oilcloth, something faintly metallic beneath. Tuppence lifted the contents one by one. Bundles of documents tied with faded string, a leather folder packed with the missing ledger pages and corroborating dispatches, and beneath those, a tin box sealed tight. Tommy forced it open with his penknife. Inside were several folded letters, their edges crisp and blackened as though singed by fire. The handwriting was precise, official, and in 2 languages. "English," Tuppence murmured, "and German." Tommy skimmed the first page, his brow furrowing. "These are military communiques, some dated 1918, others later. Look at this signature, Colonel Geoffrey Stannard, and the counter-signature, Friedrich von Gerlach." 2 officers, Tuppence said softly, on opposite sides of the war. "Not opposite, apparently." Tommy passed her another sheet. "This one speaks of an exchange. Information for safe passage, gold for names. My word, Tuppence, this isn't a chest of treasure. It's a record of treason." She read quickly, her breath catching. "A secret alliance, a handful of British officers working with their German counterparts to control post-war intelligence. They used the Cornish coast for transmissions. That's why the Fallen Star Inn was built over a signal post. It wasn't an accident. It was a cover." Tommy whistled low, and Mrs. Penruddock's husband was in it up to his neck. A soft sound made them turn. She was standing at the top of the path, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, her face pale as the mist. "You needn't whisper," she said quietly. "You've already found the truth." Tuppence rose slowly. "You knew about the chest?" Mrs. Penruddock nodded. "I helped bury it. My husband and I, the night before he died. The sea was rising fast, and he said it was safer beneath the waves than in the hands of men." Tommy studied her. He was protecting himself. "No," her voice broke. "Protecting others. Those papers, they were never meant to reach London. My husband wanted the name sealed away forever. He'd made a terrible mistake. He thought the war was ending and that peace would come quicker if certain men cooperated. But when he realized what he'd unleashed, Tuppence's tone softened. He tried to stop it. She nodded. And they killed him for it. The wind lifted the ends of her shawl, carrying with it the faint tang of salt. She looked toward the sea. Afterward, they came for the ledger, the record of every contact, every payment, every betrayal. I told them I'd burned it, but I hid it instead, in the lighthouse. I thought it would die there with him. Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence, but Lansing found out. Yes, Mrs. Penruddock whispered. He was my husband's partner once, the one man who knew the whole story. He came here last month pretending to write a book, but it wasn't literature he wanted. He threatened to expose everything unless I gave him the chest. I told him it was lost to the sea. Which, Tuppence said gently, wasn't entirely a lie. Mrs. Penruddock's eyes were wet. I never thought the tide would turn again, but now you've brought it back. Tommy crouched beside the open chest. There are more pages here, the missing folios from the ledger. He held one up. This is the entry that killed your husband. The Exchange, 1918. It names every officer involved. She stared at it as though the words themselves burned her. That page was supposed to die with him. If it ever reached the wrong hands. Her sentence cut short. A faint sound carried across the cliffs, a sharp, metallic click. Tuppence turned. A man was standing behind them, half-shadowed by the mist. His clothes were torn, salt-stained, his hair plastered against his forehead. But there was no mistaking the face. Lansing, alive. The revolver in his hand gleamed dully in the grey light. Quite the archaeologists, aren't you? His voice was hoarse but steady. Digging up graves that should have stayed shut. Tommy straightened slowly, his hands raised slightly. You seem remarkably spry for a man the sea swallowed. The sea spits back what it doesn't want, Lansing said, stepping closer. A bit of luck and a lot of rocks. I came out of the tide 2 miles down the coast. Colder, but wiser. His eyes flicked to the chest. And it seems fortune favours persistence. Mrs. Penruddock's voice was barely audible. You killed the colonel. He smiled thinly. No, my dear. He killed himself, by meddling in things beyond him, just as your husband did. Why? Tuppence demanded. What do you hope to gain now? Money? Power? The war's long over. Wars never end, Lansing said. Not for men like me. There's always another buyer for old secrets. Governments, newspapers, private collectors. The past is the only currency that never loses its value. He gestured with the gun. Step away from the chest. Tuppence didn't move. You'll never get far carrying that thing through the village. People have already seen you die once. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. You underestimate how easy it is to vanish here. Fog is a fine accomplice. Tommy took a cautious step forward. Listen, Lansing, you can't keep running. The police will... The police? His voice sharpened. They were part of it too, don't you see? Everyone was. The Fallen Star wasn't a hotel. It was a relay station, a nerve centre for intelligence passed through the coast. Every officer who ate and drank here left a piece of themselves behind. Sometimes a message, sometimes a name, sometimes a soul. He shifted his grip on the gun. And now it's my turn to collect. Mrs. Penruddock moved suddenly, stepping between him and the chest. You'll have to shoot me first. Don't think I won't, Lansing said. His hand trembled, though whether from cold or conscience none could tell. Tuppence's voice was calm. You're bluffing. If you wanted her dead, you'd have done it long ago. You need her, to authenticate the documents, to lead you to the rest. Lansing hesitated. The pause was brief, but enough. Tommy lunged. The gun went off with a deafening crack, the bullet striking stone. In the scramble that followed, Tuppence grabbed Mrs. Penruddock and pulled her clear as Tommy grappled with Lansing. They stumbled dangerously close to the cliff's edge, feet slipping on the slick rock. "Tommy!" Tuppence shouted. Lansing broke free, seizing Mrs. Penruddock by the wrist. "You want the truth?" he snarled. "Ask her what really happened to her husband." Her eyes were wide with terror. "Please!" "He didn't fall," Lansing shouted. "She pushed him after she found out what he'd done. Ask her." "That's a lie," she cried. "He took his own life to save us all." The wind rose, whipping their words away. Tommy seized Mrs. Penruddock's free arm and wrenched her clear as the shale slipped. A sharp cry, the snap of rock, and Lancing vanished over the edge. For a moment, they thought it was over. Then, far below, something, or someone, struck water with a hollow splash before the sea swallowed the sound. Below, the tide roared through a maze of black rock and foam. For a heartbeat, a dark shape tumbled, struck water, not stone, and was lost in the churn. Tommy and Tuppence reached the brink too late. The waves below surged and crashed, reclaiming what the tide had revealed. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The chest lay overturned, its contents scattered across the damp grass. Tuppence knelt, gathering what she could. "It's all here," she said quietly. "Letters, ledgers, proof of everything." Tommy stared out to sea, and yet somehow it still feels unfinished. Behind them, the rising sun broke through the mist, gilding the waves with light. The tide was already creeping back in, erasing footprints, swallowing debris, washing clean what the night had exposed. Mrs. Penruddock's voice trembled as she looked down at the ruined chest. "The sea has taken him twice now. Perhaps this time it will keep him." Tuppence folded the last damp page, placing it gently in the chest. "And what about you?" Mrs. Penruddock lifted her eyes. "I shall stay. The inn is mine, and its ghosts are too." Tommy offered her a hand. "Then let's at least make sure those ghosts can rest in peace." Together they closed the lid. The serpent and the star, dulled by years and salt, caught the sunlight one last time, before the tide rolled in again, whispering secrets only the sea would ever hear. It began with the wind, not a whispering breeze or a coastal sigh, but the full-throated roar of a storm gathering its power over the Atlantic. The sea below the cliffs heaved and darkened, foam cresting like teeth against black rock. The sky was a chaos of cloud and lightning, an orchestra tuning for disaster. Inside the Fallen Star Inn, lamps flickered, and the walls groaned as though the very timbers remembered older tempests. The last log on the fire collapsed in a shower of sparks, and the room fell into a trembling half-light. Tommy Beresford stood by the window, watching the storm roll toward shore. "It's fitting, somehow," he said quietly. "The sea started this business, seems determined to finish it." Tuppence, seated near the fire, looked up from the open chest of documents. "It's more than fitting," she replied. "It's poetic justice." Mrs. Penruddock sat opposite them, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of untouched tea. Her eyes, red-rimmed but resolute, were fixed on the fire. "He's not gone," she murmured. "You don't know him as I do. Lancing always comes back." Tommy turned. "Even a man like that can't swim forever." She shook her head slowly. "He survived worse in the war. And the sea," her voice faltered, "the sea doesn't take men like him easily." Before either could answer, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. 3 raps. Deliberate. Heavy. Tuppence was on her feet instantly. No one in their right mind would be out in this weather. Tommy moved toward the door, every instinct alert. The wind howled down the chimney as he unlatched it. The door flew open with the force of the gale, and in its frame stood a man, drenched to the bone, his eyes burning with feverish light. Lancing. He stepped inside, water pooling beneath his boots, revolver clutched tightly in one hand. His smile was thin and wild. "You see, Mrs. Penruddock," he said, "you were right. The sea doesn't take me easily." Mrs. Penruddock gave a strangled cry. God forgive you. What more do you want?" "The rest of it," he said simply, pointing the gun toward the chest. "The pages you kept from me. The ones that prove who paid for their secrets, and who killed to protect them." Tommy's tone was steady. "Put that down, Lancing. You've made your point." "Have I?" Lancing's eyes flicked between them, glittering. "I think not. You two meddled where you shouldn't have. Do you know what's in those papers, Mr. Beresford? Names that could topple governments, fortunes that vanished in the smoke of war. And this," he lifted a damp satchel from his shoulder and dropped it onto the floor. "This is what I nearly died for." Tuppence's gaze went to it. "The rest of the chest," he nodded. "The tide uncovered it at dawn. I went back for it. Thought I could beat the sea, but the rocks had other ideas." His laugh was hollow, bitter. "A broken shoulder, a mile through surf, and all for paper. Imagine that. Paper that will make me a very rich man." Tommy stepped forward. "Rich, perhaps, but not for long. Scotland Yard already knows enough to hang you twice over." Lansing's gun shifted toward him. You think they'd dare? Half of London's intelligence office was in on this. No, Mr. Beresford, they'll pay to keep it quiet. They always do. Lightning flashed, throwing his face into sharp relief, drawn, haunted, salt-streaked. The storm outside battered the windows like fists against glass. Tuppence's voice cut through the thunder. You can't sell guilt, Mr. Lansing. Only trade it for more. He turned to her, sneering. You've a sharp tongue for a lady, but perhaps you'll be useful. You're clever enough to see how valuable this is. You and your husband could walk away rich if you like. Just hand me the ledger. Tommy's tone was dry. Tempting offer, except for the bit where you shoot us afterward. The revolver swung back toward him, finger tightening on the trigger. Then a sound split the air, not thunder this time, but a shattering crash. One of the shutters on the far window tore loose, slamming against the glass. Rain burst inward in a sudden torrent. Lansing flinched. It was enough. Tommy lunged. The two men collided, the gun firing once, a deafening report that cracked through the room. The bullet buried itself in the wall beside the hearth. They grappled, the revolver slipping from Lansing's hand, clattering across the floor toward Tuppence's feet. She snatched it up, breathless. I have it, but Lansing twisted free, striking Tommy hard across the jaw. He staggered back. In a heartbeat, Lansing was at the door again, wrenching it open into the storm. Stay back, he shouted, voice swallowed by the wind. I'll not be caught here like a rat. The tide's turning again. I can still make the cliffs. Tuppence darted after him. Tommy, come on. They burst into the night. The rain was horizontal, stinging their faces like grit. The beam from the old lighthouse ruin flickered fitfully as lightning flashed over the sea, turning the waves into silver flame. Ahead of them, Lansing's figure cut through the storm, heading toward the narrow cliff path that wound above the surf. Stop him! Mrs. Penruddock's voice rang faintly behind them, carried away by the wind. The path was treacherous, slick with mud, the rocks slick and gleaming. Tommy caught sight of Lansing's silhouette as lightning flared again, a dark figure clambering toward the headland where the ruins stood. Tuppence called out over the wind, her voice sharp, taunting. You'll never make it down alive, Lansing. The tide's rising faster than you think. He turned, shouting back, I've cheated the sea once, I'll do it again. But she had seen something in his eyes, that gleam of greed that outlived all reason. She stepped closer, her voice changing, luring. Then perhaps you'd rather have what's buried there instead. The gold your partner hid. He told me where it was before he died. That stopped him. He hesitated, his breathing loud above the crash of waves. You're lying. Am I? Tuppence said calmly. You said yourself he didn't drown for paper. He was after something worth keeping. She pointed toward the rocks below the lighthouse. Under the star-shaped stone, you know the one. For a moment he stood motionless, torn between suspicion and greed. Then, with a curse, he moved toward the edge, scanning the rocks below. If you're tricking me... Tommy appeared behind him, his voice a whip of steel. She's not, but you are. Lansing spun around, too fast. His foot slipped on the wet rock. The ground gave way beneath him with a crack like gunfire. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, catching at the jagged edge. For one terrible instant he hung there, silhouetted against the lightning, the serpent and star crest gleaming faintly on the satchel across his chest. "Help me!" he gasped. Tommy reached out, but too late. The stone beneath Lansing's boots shifted again, breaking away. He fell, down into the roaring surf, swallowed by foam and thunder. For a moment, the only sound was the sea. Then, faintly, a distant flash of light, lightning striking the old lighthouse ruin. The structure shuddered, splintered, and collapsed into the waves with a sound like the end of the world. Tuppence clutched Tommy's arm. He's gone. Tommy nodded, his jaw set, this time for good. They stood there as the storm spent its fury, rain softening into drizzle. The wind eased and the dawn began to show, pale gold threading through the black sky. The sea still foamed below, but the rage had gone out of it. Back at the inn, Mrs. Penruddock waited by the fire, her face drawn and hollow. When they entered, dripping and mud-streaked, she rose silently. "Well?" Tommy's voice was gentle. "It's over." She closed her eyes. A single tear traced the curve of her cheek. "Then perhaps now," she whispered, "the sea will rest." Tuppence placed the soaked satchel on the table beside the chest. "Everything's here, the missing pages, the letters, the proof." Mrs. Penruddock looked down at them, relics of a war that had never truly ended, and sighed. "They destroyed themselves for secrets," she said softly, "and I nearly joined them." Tommy drew a chair closer for her. "You tried to protect what mattered. That's more than most can say." She smiled faintly through her tears. "I only wish I'd had your courage." Tuppence poured fresh tea, her movements gentle. "Courage takes different forms, Mrs. Penruddock. Sometimes it's fighting, sometimes it's surviving." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was the local constable, coat dripping, eyes wide from the storm. "We saw the flashes," he said breathlessly. "The lighthouse, it's gone." Tommy nodded. "So is the man responsible." The constable's gaze fell on the chest. "And this?" Tuppence closed the lid softly. "It belongs to Scotland Yard now. What's left of it?" As the constable took the chest, Mrs. Penruddock rose. "I'll stay," she said, "to rebuild. The fallen star has stood through worse storms. Perhaps it deserves peace at last." Tommy smiled faintly. "You'll have it, though I might recommend locking the doors at night." That won a small, tired laugh from her, the first in days. Later, as they stood outside, the first rays of sun pierced the thinning mist. The sea gleamed gold now, calm and endless, as though it had never known rage. Tuppence slipped her arm through Tommy's. "Do you think it's really over?" He looked toward the horizon where the ruins had been. "For this chapter, perhaps." She tilted her head, smiling. "You sound almost wistful." "Just practical," he said lightly. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the past never stays buried for long." Tuppence nodded toward the water, where the sunlight broke in dazzling shards across the waves. "No," she said softly, "but sometimes it's kind enough to wash clean what's left behind." They stood together as the morning grew brighter, the storm retreating into memory. Above the inn, the sign creaked gently in the breeze, the painted star, faded but unbroken, catching the light once more. And for the first time in years, the fallen star shone in peace. By evening, the storm had gone, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely hushed. The sea still murmured at the base of the cliffs, but the rage had gone out of it. It sounded now like a tired giant turning in his sleep. The Fallen Star Inn stood solemn against the fading light, its windows glowing softly as though remembering warmth after a long illness. Inside, the drawing room had been restored to an order it had not known in days. The fire burned steadily, the air scented faintly with polish and salt. Mrs. Penruddock had drawn the curtains early and set a fresh tea service upon the low table, not for guests, but for farewell. Tuppence sat curled in one of the old armchairs, her chin resting on her hand as she gazed into the flames. The quiet was companionable, though touched with melancholy. Tommy, sprawled opposite her with his usual air of casual watchfulness, was meticulously repairing his pipe, a sure sign that the adventure was at its end. "Well," he said at last, tamping the tobacco with care, "I suppose this counts as a successful holiday, by our standards." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Meaning that no one invited us, half the people tried to kill us, and the local scenery collapsed in our honour?" "Precisely." He struck a match and puffed thoughtfully. "Still, I can't say it was dull." "No," she said softly, "it was never dull." Mrs. Penruddock entered quietly, her step slow but sure. She had aged years in the space of days, yet her composure now had a kind of grace to it, the fragile peace of someone who had made terms with sorrow. She carried a silver tray with a pot of tea and 3 cups. "I thought," she said, "we might have one last sitting by the fire. The house feels less lonely with voices in it." Tuppence rose at once to help her. "Of course. Sit down, Mrs. Penruddock. You've done enough running this inn for a lifetime." The older woman smiled faintly. "Yes, I think that's quite true. Tomorrow I'll close it. The Fallen Star has had its last guest." Tommy raised a brow. "You're sure about that?" "Quite." She poured the tea carefully, her hand steady despite the tremor in her voice. "The inn was built for secrecy, to hide men and messages, not to welcome them. Perhaps now it can finally rest." The three of them sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint sighing of wind around the eaves. Somewhere in the distance a gull cried, its echo thin and far away. At length Mrs. Penruddock spoke again. "Elsie's leaving tomorrow as well. London, she says. A cousin there who keeps a bakery in Kensington. I think it will be good for her. There's nothing left for her here but ghosts." "London's full of ghosts too," Tommy said, half to himself. "But at least they're busy ones." Tuppence turned her gaze toward the mantel, where the remnants of the investigation lay, the damp ledger, now dried and bound with string, the papers, neatly stacked and ready for the authorities. Yet one small object sat apart from the rest, a star-shaped brooch of silver filigree, delicate and gleaming faintly in the lamplight. She reached for it. "I meant to ask you about this," she said. "We found it tucked between the last pages of the ledger." Mrs. Penruddock looked at it, and for a moment her face softened with something close to tenderness. "Ah, so it was there after all." "You recognize it?" Tuppence asked. "Yes." She hesitated, then said quietly, "It belonged to my cousin, Jane Finn." The name fell into the room like a pebble into still water. Tommy and Tuppence exchanged a quick glance. "Jane Finn," Tuppence repeated. "Then you knew her?" Mrs. Penruddock nodded slowly. "We grew up together, though I hadn't seen her in years when the war began. She was fiery, clever, far braver than I ever was. When the news came that she'd vanished in service to her country, I refused to believe she was truly gone. And then my husband told me the truth." She leaned back, eyes distant. "She'd come here once, secretly. It was she who first used the inn for intelligence work. My husband carried on her mission after she disappeared. Everything he did, even the mistakes, was meant to finish what she started. That brooch was her symbol, the fallen star. She used it as a code mark on her messages." Tuppence traced the delicate edges of the brooch with a fingertip. "So that's why the name carried through. It wasn't just a coincidence." "No," said Mrs. Penruddock, "it was legacy. Jane's light fell, but it lit others, even mine in its dim way." The fire snapped softly, and for a while none of them spoke. Tommy poured himself more tea, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange," he said. "We spend years thinking the war's behind us, and then a place like this reminds us it never really ends. Not the memories, not the debts." Tuppence smiled faintly. "You're getting philosophical again, darling." "Occupational hazard," he said lightly. "Too many ghosts make one introspective." Mrs. Penruddock looked up, her voice soft but firm. "Ghosts fade, Mr. Beresford. Only the living carry them, and you've given mine peace." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, 9, gentle and unhurried. Outside, the wind had quieted entirely, leaving only the rhythmic sound of waves below. After tea, Mrs. Penruddock retired for the night, leaving them alone with the fire. Elsie came in briefly to collect the tray. She paused by Tuppence's chair, her eyes red but hopeful. "I wanted to thank you, Ma'am," she said shyly, for being kind. I'll never forget it." Tuppence smiled warmly. "You're starting a new life, Elsie. Don't waste it looking backward." The girl nodded, then added, almost in a whisper, "I used to be afraid of the sea, but now I think it's like people, sometimes cruel, but mostly just restless." When she was gone, Tommy glanced at Tuppence. "That one will do well. London will make her tougher, or she'll make it gentler." Tuppence chuckled softly. "Let's hope for the latter. Heaven knows London could use it." They sat a while longer, letting the fire burn low. The inn creaked occasionally, settling into its newfound quiet. The scent of salt and ash lingered in the air, and Tuppence, gazing into the embers, felt the pull of both past and future, the weight of what they'd uncovered, and the strange peace that followed. "Do you think we'll ever stop finding mysteries, Tommy?" she asked. He grinned. "Not if you have anything to do with it." She laughed softly, resting her head against the chair. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep you in practice." "Someone has to," he replied. "I'd hate to go soft." The clock chimed again, softly marking the half-hour. The fire burned to glowing coals, and Tuppence's thoughts drifted like the tide, toward Jane Finn, toward Mrs. Penruddock's haunted courage, toward all the quiet women whose names never made it into the history books. The world moved on, but it was built on their silences. At last, Tommy rose and offered her his hand. "Come on, partner, time for bed. Tomorrow we head home, assuming the railway remembers how to run after all this weather." "Do you think Mrs. Penruddock will be all right here alone?" "She won't be alone," Tommy said, glancing toward the window where dawn's first faint glimmer touched the horizon. "She has the sea and peace at last. I think she's earned both." The morning came clear and bright, as though the world had been scrubbed clean. The cliffs shone pale gold in the sunlight, and gulls wheeled lazily overhead. The air smelled of heather and salt. Tommy and Tuppence stood on the small platform as the train whistled in the distance, a column of smoke rising above the hills. Mrs. Penruddock had come to see them off, wrapped in her dark shawl. Her eyes were tired, but she smiled. "The inn will always be here," she said softly, "even if it's empty. Sometimes it's enough just to stand guard over what's finished." Tuppence pressed her hand gently. "And Jane's memory?" Mrs. Penruddock looked toward the sea. "She's part of it now. Every sunrise, every tide, that's how she'd want it." The train pulled in with a hiss of steam. Tommy helped Tuppence aboard, tipping his hat to the station master, who looked mildly startled to see anyone leaving so early. As the carriage began to move, Tuppence leaned from the window. Mrs. Penruddock stood waving, the sunlight glinting off the silver brooch pinned at her collar, the fallen star shining one last time. Tuppence settled into her seat beside Tommy. "Another adventure, darling?" He smiled, eyes twinkling. "After tea, perhaps." The train curved along the coast, the cliffs gleaming behind them, and the sea stretched wide and blue beneath the morning sun, calm, endless, and for once at peace.